Then part three. So about the time. So the one of the latest IIT paper was about the structure of sort of time extension, or how do you call it? I don't know. But yeah, how the IIT actually explains time.
Yeah.
Experience of time, and many of the people have been complained IIT's actions. In part, it doesn't have space and also time in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the most frequently asked questions about actions, right?
Yes.
But now the approach of the IIT is to try to explain why time feels this way, time flows, and the space feels extended from the first principle of IIT. And then now you are coming to this, time proposal, and so you definitely have a lot of ideas proposed from a philosophy side or psychology side. What do you think is the most sort of the challenging aspect of the time, or remaining kind of question about time, or what has this IIT version of the time explanation achieved in that paper?
So, well, for sure, one thing that IIT has achieved, I think, with the time paper is that accounting for the experience of time connects very, very deeply to the mechanisms and the substrate of consciousness itself, right? Because there is this idea that since we experience time, and we even have maybe an idea of the continuity of consciousness per se, but we definitely experience things changing and things flowing, and to a certain extent our experience is unfolding time. There is this idea that the substrate of consciousness must be itself something that is unrolls in time. So it's something like a process or something that changes in the brain, and somehow the integration happens across time, and that consciousness emerges from this sequence of states, which is a very intuitive idea. But I think the most striking consequence of the approach of IIT to begin with, but now complemented with an account of time, is really that actually, as counterintuitive as it might sound, it's more reasonable to think that a substrate in a state is responsible for one experience, and the content of this experience might be that there has been a sequence of events that are still within your experience, part of this, let's call it specious present or extended present, then yet exist right here and right now in your brain, in its state, that is something that might have a temporal grain, but it can be much, much shorter than your experience of time, right? So this is interesting because it connects, of course, to some views in philosophy of time, from Kant to Husserl. So the idea that when we talk about time, are we really talking about the time that exists in the world, like the clock time of physics, or are we talking about a sort of mental category that interprets the world as having this dimension of time? And it is more consistent with, of course, with IIT to say that we experience change and flow of time because it is a content of our experience, and it is not an essential property, because there can be experiences that don't include this content, which are both conceivable and achievable. You can be in a state where you don't experience the flow of time anymore. So yeah.
So the one of the consequences of this, IIT's account for time is that the very striking kind of worldview, but it's also possibly consistent with the Buddhism or Indian philosophy, right? Which is probably something that we also want to talk today. But every moment, experience is born about this experience, and then if you can sort of slow down the moment, experience emerge now, which includes the things that has happened a little bit before because of the micro grain, which constrains its future and its past in some way, but a little bit sliding. The time is sliding like this way in physical clock time kind of way. That itself is another independent, consciousness, but it overlaps a lot with a little bit before. and that potentially kind of, produces a sense of continuity, but essentially, each experience at the limit, it may be almost continuous in clock time, is reborn at each moment, right?
Yes. So the interesting thing about accounting for time with the tools of IIT is that time seems to be both a content of experience and a feature of consciousness itself. But in IIT, I think it's an attempt to disentangle the two notions. And when we talk about consciousness itself, time is not needed because, in a sense, and this is in line maybe with Buddhism and some Indian philosophy, when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about being, we're talking about existence, we're talking about a state that you exist, you are in a state, that's all there is. And this can be, in principle, even instantaneous, that nothing needs to change, nothing needs to happen in time for the possibility that being is, right? So,
but being is defined or characterized or constrained by how this being could have been and could be into the future.
Yes.
The moment is not completely disconnected from past and future. That's not the case, right?
No, it's not the case. So there is a state, there is a system in a state that right now, by virtue of being what it is, we can say constrained or specifies information about itself in the past and itself in the future. But really, when we say past and future, we just say it causes itself. So it's specifying some information about itself on the cause side and itself on the effect side. So it's more about causation than about time.
Right.
So this is a characterization of being in terms of cause-effect power that requires a notion of cause and effect, that a notion of update, in a sense that is just a causal change. The fact that something can make a difference and can take a difference, can be affected causally, right? But when we talk about time as really the fact that there is a direction, there is a flow of events, and there is also a sense that things have changed, that things are flowing and happening, that is in this case, it can be, it's not a necessary property of existence, but it can be a content of the experience. So right here, right now, I might wake up and the first thing that I experience in my experience is that maybe I don't know, something has just happened, and that's completely consistent with me existing in that moment, for the first time after the night not being there, being completely unconscious. So time is a dimension of consciousness in the sense of content of consciousness, and time as a metaphysical feature of being. These are two separate notions, and I think it's important to disentangle them in this sense. With one attempt is to do it with IIT in this way.
Yeah, but it's kind of exactly what you said a moment ago. When we start to talk about this content one by one, then something that even at the level of actions might start to feel like maybe shaky, or you need to make something to everything logically consistent, or maybe it's not possible to do that. One of the things is about the exclusion. I talked about this with you a bit before, but in IIT, in a given clock time moment of this update, now where the world is in a sense instantaneously kind of set into the plane, right, in a sense. And then everything here is the current moment, and then if you participate onto this consciousness from these red things to here, I mean, a part of my brain participating in this, and then previous state of this thing can also participate into this. Maybe this is not the way to say that, but a macro state of this substrate, which has, let's say, thickness of the time, right? Over 100 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds of brains, neurons, state, which is macro state, treated as macro state, participate in this current state of consciousness, and then you cannot expect something outside of this complex to participate in this one because of the exclusion. You cannot participate, this guy participate in this consciousness and this consciousness. That's not possible. But if you think about this, sort of the wave front of the consciousness now or state, just 1 millisecond. That itself has a consciousness in here, also another consciousness here potentially. But the macro state of the neurons within 30 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, coming from the current front line of the now, includes this overlapping 29 milliseconds of this neural substrate, which is actually participating in this consciousness now, and also 1 millisecond as well. And I thought that requires at least explanation or fundamental kind of answer how this is not an excluded. Well, why across time exclusion is not necessary, but across the space exclusion is necessary.
So I think the idea is that...
Was my question clear?
Yeah.
Okay,
well, it's just to me. I don't know if it is clear.
all right.
I liked your way of describing it in this way. So in IIT, the macro state is basically a macroing, right, of micro states. We can imagine the shortest possible update of the universe and one can measure. We can notice differences, right? We could notice that we have to somehow notice a difference in, let's say, a distance in a picosecond, an interval of a picosecond between a state and the next state. We have to notice that something has changed, and so we can call that an update. We can say sometimes has passed in clock time, right? So the fact that we notice something changes, that is definitely an observation. It's of operational nature, in the sense that we are observing something has changed. And then we can ask what exists at this time step, this time step, this time step, right? So by nature of dividing clock time in this way, it's a legitimate question to ask how many conscious entities exist at every time step. However, just like we take spatial macroings, right? We can say, I'm not necessarily asking whether an entity exists at the micro level in spatial, just like in special dimensions, I'm considering only single atoms. It's a meaningful sense to say there is a conscious entity that exists right now, but what is important for this conscious entity's existence is actually what has happened in the past 30 seconds or 30 milliseconds, something like that, right? However, it is existing right now. So the macroing in time doesn't necessarily mean that there is overlap between conscious entities, because they don't exist in time, they exist instantaneously over a certain amount of time. I don't know if this is something that is...
I don't know. This is a part that I'm still having difficulty. But this kind of implies that the time and space has a very different kind of status.
I see.
Right? Unlike physics. Physicists talk about the space-time.
Yes.
And space and time is not separable. But in IIT, it is.
Yeah, so yes. So what you're trying to say is that basically you can have a notion of an update that is in the temporal dimension. So you can macro, and you can take units of clock time as updates, and there is never exclusion between what exists at this update and what exists at this update. But for every update, they can exist at different grains, temporal grains. But then for space instead, you can have a single update where a complex exists and it can exist at different spatial grains, but now the spatial grains sort of constrain each other. I can't have that something exists here and also in an overlapping portion of space, basically. Yeah.
So maybe one potential way to think about it that the space or time is not really fundamental, but something else is more fundamental in IIT, and that could be this notion of update or units in space and time, and also the causation.
Yes, that for sure. I think it doesn't even make much sense if you think about it. It doesn't even make much sense to ask how much time, so the time interval or of a causal update, right? Because the only thing that you can notice is that there was a change. Maybe some units turned on, some units turned off. But how much time was elapsed? If you don't have a way to track changes that are smaller than your shorter update, then it's a sort of like quantum of causation in the universe.
I see. So I'm really like a novice in this time domain literature, but I started to read something called Time and Knowledge by Hans Primas, and the notion of change as a fundamental, and also the Carlo Rovelli's book on time, time doesn't exist or something like that. Aristotle's idea of time is that change, right? And the Newtonian idea of time is a clock time in the universe. And Leibniz is more to do with a change, like a relational basis of the time. And in that sense, IIT's fundamental units of the time is basically the update side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think in philosophy of physics and fundamental physics, there is this idea that you can define spatial relations and temporal relations based on, so you can either define causation based on spatial temporal relations because you observe that something happens and then there is a change. So you can say this happened and then this happened. That's the Humean way of inferring that. You can call it causation, but just you have observed a sequence of events, right? That's one way where you can say causation is actually grounded in spatial temporal relations and things that change. But you can also see the other way around. So you can define spatiotemporal relations based on causation. So you can say, for instance, this is classical relativity. It's the notion of simultaneity is actually based on the observer and the fact that some things can causally interact. So whatever, so spatiotemporal relations are based on the capacity to causally interact, so to affect of things to affect each other. And if this is the case, then time is really a consequence of causation instead of the other way around. Space, I think, is a bit more intuitive because you can say, if I notice a correlation between the changes of something in a location of the universe and something in another location of the universe, even though these things are light years apart, I can consider that there is non-local, connection, but they are causally connected because they are correlated. Some of their states are correlated, right? So you can define proximity and distance in space based on correlation that you observe in the states, and you can infer that there is a causal connection, and you can do something similar with time. So IIT would definitely take causation as being fundamental. This still means, though, that there is a notion of an update that it is the unit of causation, so to speak. You can observe a causal event, a causal chain, because there is an input and an output, and something changes in the update of a unit based on its inputs and output. But it doesn't make much sense to talk about this temporally in the sense that there is no interval of time that has elapsed between these two, which is change, right?
I see. So, as you know, I kind of proposed this periodic table-like idea of the Fourier structure. Now, sort of, if you can find sort of the finest or narrowest level of the Fourier type, it could be put into the sort of the periodic table-like thing, and then the combining this periodic table, we may be able to explain more complicated or compound Fourier, and that's like proposing atoms first, and then to hope that maybe there are lots of molecules that are actually happening in the universe. But then, and at that time I was thinking about at the time proposal, space and time could be one of the atoms, like helium, and also hydrogen could be space and time. But maybe that's still true, but even fundamental ingredients of this different kind of Fourier type could be, let's say, we call it as a quark-like thing, quark model of a Fourier. Could be, one is like, let's say, update, or everything combined as a sort of a causation, right? From causation, by combining causation in many different ways, different types of the Fourier type at the level of atom kind of emerge. Is it sort of the close to this kind of idea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you think about, so at least the IIT view is that you can consider fundamental kinds of qualia, like atoms, in the sense of qualia, as the contents of experience, like space, time, color, motion, these kind of things, right? But ultimately, if you consider the account in terms of cause-effect structures, each content of experience, like the smallest possible unit that you can call spatial, is going to be a set of distinctions and relations in a cause-effect structure.
Right.
What does that mean exactly? It means that there are units that specify causes and effects, and there are relations between these causes and effects. So there are overlaps, causal overlaps. So it gets to what you were saying, that ultimately you have these fundamental quarks, so to speak, that are literally causal atoms, like causes and effects. And then the way in which you can relate causes and effects specified by different mechanisms should give you everything that we can recognize in experience, such as space, time, and objects. So
I see.
it's patterns of relations between causes and effects that organize them and order them in such a ways that spatial extendedness comes out and temporal flow comes out.
I see. Now, yeah, it's kind of a revelation. That has not probably happened in the other previous interview. But okay, so thinking about the quark over Korea as potentially like a causation, cause, into the past, and also effect into the future, and relation. How this cause and effects are related.
Yeah.
These are the three kind of minimum ingredient, and then by combining these three, in how do you do that in other way? You can kind of reconstruct the Fourier type of the space, Fourier type of time, and Fourier type of the color, Fourier type of the motion, and so on.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, that's the idea why if it is, if it
so
is
then,
correct.
that's interesting, because then what we can propose as a sort of atomic number. When I talked about this periodic table idea, many of the problem actually came up, and one of the things is that what is the organizing principle of this, right? So the organizing principle is not a number in this case, but it's a kind of primitive sort of the kind of a relationship between the cause and the effects and the relation. Right, like a cause relation and a cause and the effects and the relation in the directed way, that's a time, and the cause and the effect in a
reflexive way,
sort of the homogeneous way, that's a space.
Yeah,
and that kind of way of categorizing cause and the effects and the relations would essentially classify different Fourier types.
Yeah.
That's at least a theoretical explanation.
Yeah, that's correct. It's tricky because it's not necessarily the number of distinctions and relations that are involved, so the numbers of causes and effects. In fact, we have two causes and one effect, and it's not as simple as that.
It's not simple.
No.
Yeah, no.
But I think one can ultimately define the minimal sort of like the, how can I say, sort of like the seed of a content of experience, like the seed of space, the seed of time, the seed of objects, as being something like that.
Okay. All right. So then maybe we can just continue, or let's stop.
Yeah.
All right.